When the US started extending its influence across Asia and Africa, it never imagined that its long-standing allies in Western Europe or Latin America would slip away. While Europe still maintains strong political and economic ties with the US, the case isn't the same for Latin America.
That the United States is not a friend anymore.
President Lula, you're leading a very big delegation to China.
Latin America is gradually tilting towards China, a shift that was once unthinkable.
China.
So how is China spreading its influence in America's backyard? What does it mean for the future, and can the US ever stop this? Let's find out. This is the story of how the US is losing Latin America to China. Chinese investments in Latin America. On November 14, 2024, Chinese President Xi Jinping and Peruvian President Dina Boluarte inaugurated Chancay Port in Peru, some 48 miles north of capital Lima. This port brings in hundreds of trade opportunities and changes trading routes forever, not just for Peru, but for all of South America. This megaport has only been made possible through a $1.3 billion investment by Beijing, but this isn't the only one. In fact, China has established its foothold in some 40 ports across the American continent, from Mexico all the way down in Argentina. China has also built 11 satellite ground stations in Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, and Venezuela. These projects give Latin American nations access to better infrastructure and job opportunities. China's Belt and Road Initiative, which initially aimed to revive the ancient Silk Road and to connect West Asia and Europe through land routes, has also reached Latin America. Panama, Venezuela, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay are all part of China's BRI, showing how much China wants to spread its influence in the region. And it's not just a matter of the future, it's also a matter of the present. In 2021, China's trade with Latin American countries accounted for around $449 billion. You'll understand just how large this number is when you compare it with figures from 2002, when it stood at only $18 billion. In this mutual trade, Latin America provides China with soybeans, petroleum, copper, oil, and other raw materials. China, in return, provides high-tech products and other manufactured goods. From 2005 to 2021, China Development Bank and China Export-Import Bank collectively offered more loans to Latin American and Caribbean countries than what World Bank granted them during the same period. This shows that China does care about those countries, or at least pretends that it does. Since 2000, China has poured $75 billion worth of investment into the raw materials sector of Latin America, building refineries and processing plants for coal, natural gas, oil, and uranium. China has invested another $4.5 billion in lithium production in Latin America, most of which has been invested in Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia. These three are together referred to as the Lithium Triangle, as they hold half of the world's lithium reserves. If you think that China is investing only in South America, think again. China is heavily focused on mutual trade and pouring investments in northern countries of Latin America, which are geographically closer to the US. Take Mexico, for example, which sits right at the US border. Bilateral trade between Mexico and China crossed the $100 billion mark in 2023. China usually exports heavy machinery and electronic components to Mexico, while Mexico exports raw materials and agricultural goods to China. Chinese firms, many of which are state-owned, have also made huge investments in Mexico. Net foreign direct investments from China to Mexico reached an all-time high in 2023 with a capital expenditure of $5.6 billion, an increase of more than 20 times from 2018, when it stood at $267 million. Not only has the Chinese government reserved $3.5 billion worth of investment for Mexico, but it is also trying to motivate private countries and individuals to invest in each other's countries. Both countries have established a double taxation agreement that prevents companies and individuals from being taxed on the same income. But why is China doing all of this? We'll discuss that in the next section. But before that, if you enjoy learning about today's fascinating economic stories, be sure to subscribe. Why is China investing in Latin America? Why does any country invest in or sign mutual trade agreements with another country? Obviously for mutual economic benefits and to help individual citizens trade easily with countries that are already going to trade with. The same can be said about Chinese investments in Latin America.
China views its capacity in telecommunications and ICT, but also in wide-ranging innovation.
But is it really the case for China and Latin America? It's understandable when long-standing historic allies have trade agreements, but no Latin American nation is a historic Chinese ally. And while this trade does offer mutual financial benefit, let's be honest, Latin American nations need China more than China needs them. So why is China so interested in these states on the other side of the Pacific Ocean? Perhaps the actual reason is more than just economic benefit. Every nation that trades more with China than the US and its allies is also a political ally, which, in case of a major conflict, would automatically side with China, and if they don't, China might impose tariffs on it, pretty much the same way the US has been forcing countries to toe its line. Furthermore, China also has debt traps to dominate the world. Basically, it gives huge unconditional loans to developing and struggling nations. China ensures that it gives them more than they can return, and when they cannot, they're forced to share sovereignty in some parts of the country with China. And what would happen to those parts? They'll become military bases. For this reason and others, China already has a military presence in the region.
The space station of China
with military personnel, Chinese military personnel.
Since the early 2000s, senior leaders of the People's Liberation Army of China have visited the region more than 200 times to meet their counterparts. PLA has established a high-level defense forum with the community of Latin American and Caribbean states and offers professional military education to military personnel in these countries. This region is practically America's backyard and has been completely influenced by them for most of modern history. But times are now changing. So what does China's growing presence in Latin America mean for the US? Let's discuss that in the next section. What this means for the US. Earlier we discussed that China started spreading its influence in this region only after the year 2000, but before that it was dominated both economically and politically by the US. This region was allied to the US as much as Western Europe, but with China's growing influence, the US is now about to lose it completely. This island, known as Margarita Island in Panama, was once an American military base, but in 2017 it was purchased by a Chinese company. In the past, the US enjoyed another strategic advantage over China in Asia, which China is now about to tackle in Latin America. To understand this better, let's take a look at China. Most of the country's population and industry is located in its eastern region. Many of the major cities like Beijing, Shanghai, and Tianjin are also in the same region, not far from the East China Sea. But it's not only the Chinese cities that are located near the East China Sea. There are also countries like South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, which not only are America's close allies, but are also home to several American military bases. Keep in mind that Japan isn't just this, but also includes all these islands stretching all the way to Taiwan. The US can completely block Chinese access to the Pacific Ocean, or easily attack it in case of an all-out war. For most of the time, the US has enjoyed this strategic advantage over China, while China had no close ally to its border. But China is now reversing this situation. While it wasn't able to get the American military presence away from the East China Sea, it has now started to develop its own presence close to the US border. Don't get me wrong, even if China manages to establish some military bases in Latin American countries other than Mexico, it doesn't pose as much of a threat to the US as the US poses to China. Until now, Mexico remains a close US ally, and despite having some ties with the investment bank, Mexico's largest trading partner is also the US, which ensures the US that Mexico will remain its ally. But can that change too? The answer is yes. China's influence only keeps on increasing, and at some point in the future, the US might lose Mexico as well. So what can the US do about this? Well, nothing. They cannot stop China or sovereign Latin American countries from having stronger ties with each other. All they can do is ensure that their relations don't get worse. And if China gains allies in the region, the US doesn't lose them. But is the US doing enough for that? It doesn't seem so. Among all the Latin American countries, the US needs Mexico the most. Even then, Donald Trump has threatened to impose 25% tariffs on Mexico. China might soon completely dominate Latin America, and the US isn't doing as much as it can to stop this. But the situation might change in favor of the US, just like it once changed in favor of China. Do you think the US will be able to wrestle back the influence in Latin America that it lost to China? Or will China remain unstoppable, soon establishing its military bases in Mexico right across the US border? Share with us your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button to stay tuned to the channel. See you in the next video soon.